Alright, YouTube, now let's talk about YCS Long Beach. Now, there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of, theory, predictions as to what's going to win, everyone kind of having their own opinions. Let me talk about what I personally think. Now, I still think this is going to be a good event, in spite of how bad the format is right now, and I still find it playable, but I'm not going to deny the format sucks. There's pretty much no way around that. I just realized that, over time, bad formats can still be playable. I mean, last year's Nationals format, I had very mixed feelings on because, on one hand, there was a lot of different decks being played, but it felt like so many of those decks were plants, and that I wasn't a fan of. Here, though, the thing I like about this event, really, is there's arguably a bunch of viable decks for numerous reasons. I think when people talk about the big three and they talk about Insectors, Windups, Dino Rabbit, I personally think that those are like the most popular decks, and those are the decks that people are most sure of are capable of winning events. But I don't think those are necessarily the only decks, as people have talked about. Personally, I'm a big fan of Team Invictus, especially Courtney Waller, because Courtney is not a meta player. He's always going to find a way to be different and play a deck that's perfectly viable in the current format, but isn't a meta deck. He'll play a different deck, but he'll be reasonable about it. Hence why he was able to win with his Chaos Control deck. Because his Chaos Control deck may not have been perfect, but it was perfectly good in the format. Why? The only thing that bugged me was that it didn't have a particularly good matchup against, Dark Worlds or Plants or Rabbits, so I didn't quite understand why he won. So ultimately, I would have to argue it might have something to do with the fact it might have more to do with the player than the deck itself. But hey, people are gonna have their own bullshit arguments about that. I'm all for people like Courtney Waller. But let's get into kind of what are your options if you're not planning to play one of those three decks. Well, first off, you could play a skill drain based deck. Now, of course, the problem people are going to have with skill drain based decks is the fact that if you don't, it's not so much a reliance on skill drain that's the problem. The real problem that you're going to have with this deck is just the fact that, as you can see, negate all fields, negate all effects, whatever. As you're going to see, the problem with the deck could be if you're just unable to set up, or if you're just there will be games where it's if you don't get skill drain out quickly enough, you're gonna lose. I guess yeah, I should take that back. Part of it probably does have to do with reliance on skill drain. That's the problem. But you could still win without it. It just really depends on what other back rows you have. But skill drain is going to be a very important part of your ability to win because of its ability to lock the opponent down. Again, though, my issue with this card is just that it's not going to be people are going to play certain decks that aren't really hurt by this, and that's where you're going to need to kind of improvise or make sure that your deck can hold its own against those types of decks. I think it's just a matter of these types of decks. Usually, my concern is, can they deal with big monsters that are put on the board? This was my old issue with Tech Genus. Because of all the power cards out, this became an increasing issue in the September format. I thought the deck became less viable, and I think it's maximizing this deck's viability is just having as many outs to those big monsters as possible, because then you don't need to rely so much on skill drain where they can't set up. Where you have to worry about them setting up with on you. You just have to make sure you have a way to deal with whether they're able to get out those big monsters, with or without skill drain out. You need to have outs to those plays. So yeah. But more specifically, I know people are going to probably disagree, but I still think this deck is viable in the current format. Tech Genus. Speaking of the deck, I'm very iffy on this deck, and this was the reason why I ended up playing Hero Beat at the end of last format instead of this deck. Really, you could still do the awesome plays of Striker into Werewolf into Rush Rhino, but number one, you can't make Trishula anymore. That's definitely annoying. And you only have one striker, so you can't really make... you're not going to be using your extra deck as often, for sure. Like, yeah, some players only use 2 striker, but that still made a big difference when it comes down to it. Horn of the Phantom Beast is probably going to be the key card in this deck. In my opinion, now you kind of have to run something like either Barbaros or Photon Saber Tiger to make up for this, because this card is almost like... It basically says, your monster now becomes a beat stick. What now? And it's just an inherent +2. I love this card for many reasons, so let's just leave it at that. But... again, the weakness of this deck is just what I talked about. If they don't have a way of dealing with big monsters, if they can't stop your opponent's big monster plays, you're kind of screwed. So it's just a matter of having enough back row to stop them and being able to produce big monsters to deal with their big monsters, you know, without withdrawing advantage. Hence why I suggest Barbaros. That card is awesome. This is going to seem really odd, and I honestly, there aren't that many decks I could talk about, you know, with the cards, but I'm kind of talking straight up anti-meta stun right now. Theoretically, this is a really bad choice because a lot of decks can sort of play around some of these cards. Doom Caliber Knight, okay, it, you know, hand traps destroy it, but my argument would be hand traps are starting to see less and less play, so now I wonder, maybe this card will see a comeback. Sorry, not a comeback, a spike in play, and we'll be, we'll see a little bit of use at Long Beach, who knows. Fossil Dyna kind of suffers from a different, I can't speak. Fossil Dyna is also plagued by this format. It's less playable, but for different reasons. Fossil Dyna suffers from the fact that certain decks can just get around them fairly easily. Dino Rabbit being a very good example, because they have cards in because they're dinos, they're so-called in-hand dead dinos can just be summoned and run this over. Inzectors have no trouble getting around this card because they just go Hornet and Pop, which really sucks for you. So yeah, I guess I would say though, it's like, if you play the right deck and you bring the set out at the right time, he can be game breaking, but it's just in general, by himself, he's just kind of underwhelming right now. Thunder King kind of is in that same boat. The decks that really saw play, you know, Thunder King's good against, but he causes you to waste your normal summon on him. He won't always get that much use. Your opponent can play around him fairly easily if they're playing an explosive enough deck, and decks that aren't that explosive, like Inzectors, can just pop him and say, okay, whatever. And then you've got Barbaros, who's, you know, again, it's kind of a skill drain card, but you need skill drain to make this card amazing, but still kind of anti-meta, and, you know, this is one of those cards where it's like, if your opponent has no back rows, and you just bring this guy out, it's basically, you have like 2 turns to deal with this, or I win. I guess, well, Lightsworn, I don't think this card is all that good, sorry, I don't think this deck is going to be much better. I think people are starting to realize that, but people have told me there's like a new loop of some kind, not loop, but just a really good combo with this deck, now that Lumina's at 2, so, and all I could tell you is it involves Levier. That's all I could tell you, but regardless, I still am not convinced this deck is going to do all that well this weekend. I'm just not sure. And then, of course, Heroes, whether you go with mass change, but the one card I didn't talk about in my last video that's really going to make a huge difference for this deck, Super Poly. Super Poly is one of the hero deck's best cards right now, and unfortunately, Skill Drain Hero Beat doesn't usually run this, but it is amazing. Also, super rare, secret rare people, looks super sexy. This card, for me, is one of the reasons why I don't fear the Dino Rabbit matchup as much, and it's so good against most decks that's why I run 2 of them as opposed to just 1. Sure, against Insectors, the card sucks, but the thing about Super Poly that is nice is that if you're so desperate to fuse you're going to use your own monsters, well, you could just do that. Sometimes it actually does work out to your advantage, especially against Insectors. I'm just a, big fan of this card overall. But, against Dino Rabbit, they can't negate it. They just can't negate it, period, and they can't even respond to it. It is stupid how good it is. again, heroes I think are... I don't want heroes to... Like, the thing is, I don't want heroes to win Long Beach because I don't want these decks to, like, become more popular. I want heroes to stay somewhat of a rogue deck, but I expect at least one hero deck to top tomorrow because just for the fact that heroes are under the radar and they're powerful. They are very powerful and people just don't realize it. But more importantly than that, they're consistent. I wish people would realize that. But other decks you could really run that are reasonable. I would say, if there's any more I could think of, ninjas are potentially a good deck. It's just you're not gonna really make a pure ninja deck. You're gonna want to make combine the ninja archetype with something. Where is it? Yeah, Hanzo. Hanzo's obviously really good, so keep that in mind. Some people will tell you to run evils. I personally don't think the deck's all that consistent from testing, as well as my friend testing. I'm not gonna say the guy who topped at Atlanta was a fluke, but I definitely am surprised that deck worked as well as it did for him. And even with the search card coming out in Galactic Overlord, I still am very iffy about the deck. Main other decks, I mean, Monarchs are a potential option, as people have brought up, because enemy controller on Rabbit is just stupid. Against the Rabbit deck is stupid. Monarchs are pretty much the only way you can actually, that you can deal with them if you play like enemy controller or something. And just stuff like that. Now, I wish I could think of more decks, but honestly, it's just a matter of, there's you have options. If your rogue deck is just, think about it this way. Think about make sure that your deck is good enough to compete with Rabbit, Windups, and Insectors. Make sure your side deck is prepared to deal with those decks, but also think about your side deck dealing with your worst type of matchups, the decks you're gonna hate to face the most, and make sure to be prepared. What people don't realize is people think it's like format is bad when you aren't prepared to side for everything. Really, it's not all that hard. You can't side for everything, sure, but if you're smart enough, you should be able to side for everything that you are most concerned about facing. And you have to make choices. You have to choose for what decks do you want to be most prepared for, what types of decks do you want to be most prepared for. If you don't have a certain card, decide that's not because the format's bad, that's ultimately because it was your choice. I can't stress that enough. Good luck to everybody competing in Long Beach tomorrow. I kind of wish I was going, but at the same time, I got an epic Nerf gun war happening tonight, so I will look forward to that. To all those running Dino Rabbit, you have no souls. I'm just kidding. And hope you found this discussion helpful. Sorry that it was a little all over the place. But yeah, guys, have a great weekend. And again, enjoy the 100th YCS. Peace out, guys.